The night Joseph called, Daniel was fixing a lamp that didn't need fixing. His best friend's voice was shaking, and that alone was enough because Joseph never shook. He said his daughter Olivia was coming home, and she was coming back broken. Daniel agreed to look after her the way you'd agree for a brother, without thinking, without knowing what it would cost him. He didn't plan on the way she'd look at him like she was waiting to be hurt again, and he sure didn't plan on the slow, frightening moment when Protector became something else entirely. Daniel lived alone on a small place outside a quiet town, the kind of town where the mail carrier knows your name and the dogs bark at nothing in particular. He was in his mid-50s, broad through the shoulders, with hands that had spent 30 years building and mending things that other people gave up on. The house was his, paid off and plain, with a porch that faced east and a yard that stayed just tidy enough to keep the neighbors from talking. A person could see the whole of his life from that porch, the workshop out back, the truck with the dented fender, the row of young maples he'd planted the year his wife left. He kept to himself not because he disliked people, but because he'd learned that silence was cheaper than small talk and a good deal more honest. He liked the quiet. Most evenings he sat out there with a glass of something and watched the light go down over the fields, and he'd made a kind of peace with the fact that the porch was built for two and only ever held one. His wife had left 11 years back, not in anger, but in search of a life that fit her better, and he'd never blamed her for it. Some people need noise and company and a room full of voices, and he needed neither, and so they parted the way, two roads split, with a quiet nod and no real grudge. She'd wanted to travel and meet people and fill the house with music, and he'd wanted to sit on the porch and listen to the crickets, and there wasn't a villain in that story, just two people who couldn't build a life in the same shape. He hadn't dated much since a few dinners here and there that went nowhere worth remembering, because the women he met wanted a man who talked more and planned more and had more to say about himself than his work and his porch. None of them stayed. He figured he was the kind of man who'd grow old alone and be mostly fine with it, and that had stopped feeling sad to him a long time ago and just started feeling true. He met Joseph when they were both still boys running barefoot through the same creek beds, and the friendship between them had outlasted every other thing in Daniel's life. Where Daniel was quiet, Joseph was warm and loud, the kind of man who filled a room just by walking into it and who could talk a fence post into standing. They didn't need to fill the silence when they sat together on the porch. And that was the whole trick of it, because most men can't stand a quiet friend, but Joseph treasured one. Over the years, they'd helped each other raise barns and bury parents and drink through the bad stretches. And not once had Daniel ever had to ask what Joseph needed, because he already knew. Joseph had been the one to sit with him the year of the divorce, not saying anything wise, just showing up every Saturday with a six-pack and his own quiet way of being there, and Daniel had never forgotten it and never would. So when the phone rang that Tuesday night and Joseph's voice came through, thin and scared, Daniel set down the lamp and listened the way he'd listened for 40 years with his whole. Joseph said Olivia was coming home, and the way he said her name told Daniel everything before the rest of the words did. His stomach dropped. She'd left town 5 years ago for a man everyone had warned her about, a man with a soft voice and hard hands who'd slowly pulled her away from everything she loved until there was nothing left of the girl she used to be. Now it was over, whatever it was, and she was coming back to her father's house with a single bag and a look in her eyes that Joseph said he didn't recognize as his daughter. He told Daniel he couldn't reach her, that she wouldn't talk to him, that she sat on the couch like a person waiting out a storm she'd already lost. He asked Daniel, in the careful way a proud man asks for help, whether Daniel would keep an eye on her, not fix her and not push her, just be around, just be a steady presence in a house that had gone strange and cold. Daniel said yes, the way he said yes to everything Joseph ever asked, which is to say, without weighing it and without any real thought about himself. To him, it was a favor for a brother, and brothers don't calculate the cost before they give their word. He remembered Olivia as a small girl with skinned knees who used to hand him the wrong tools in his garage and laugh when he used them anyway, and that memory was the lens he carried as he drove to Joseph's house the next morning. He pictured a hurt kid is the thing, a child who needed a quiet adult in the corner of the room, and he had no idea, standing in that driveway with the engine still ticking, that the woman who opened the door would knock that old picture clean out of his hands. He saw her before Joseph did, standing in the kitchen doorway with a mug held in both hands like she was afraid someone might take it from her. The long, dark hair fell past her shoulders, and her face was the kind of beautiful that makes damage harder to look at, because you can see exactly what was there before something wore it down. She was thinner than a woman her age should be, and she moved the way people move when they're trying not to take up space, small steps, shoulders curved in, eyes on the floor. She looked like a woman who'd been erased. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet, and he pushed it down hard because naming it felt like a thing he had no right to do. He tipped his chin at her the way he tipped his chin at everyone, and he said her name once, just once, and she looked up and looked away just as fast, and that quick look told him more about her than a long conversation ever could. The first week she barely spoke, and the house took on the hushed weight of a place where someone is dying even though no one was. The silence was the loudest part. She slept on her father's couch with the blanket pulled to her chin, and she ate only when Joseph set a plate in front of her and sat down across the table and waited her out. She flinched at screen doors and dropped spoons and startled at the sound of a truck on gravel, and each small jump told Daniel more about what she'd lived through than any story could have. He came by every day that week with a reason that wasn't really a reason, fixing the porch railing Joseph had been meaning to get to for 2 years, and he worked slow and said nothing and let the sound of the hammer do the talking for him. She watched him from the window sometimes, and he could feel her watching the way you feel a draft, but she never came out, and he never asked her to, because asking would have been a kind of pressure, and pressure was the last thing she needed. The wound came out in pieces, never all at once, the way a broken thing shows you its cracks instead of its whole shape. He learned from Joseph and from the few words Olivia let fall that she'd had a job she loved once, a small studio where she taught kids to paint, and the man had talked her out of it a little at a time until she couldn't remember why she'd liked it in the first place. She'd moved cities for him, given up her friends one by one, let her phone go quiet, until by the end she had no money of her own and no sense of who she'd been before him. The final break wasn't something anyone described in cruel detail, because the details would have been a kind of cruelty themselves, and Daniel understood that the shame of having stayed too long was its own wound, deeper than whatever the man had done with his hands. What he knew was that she'd left with a bag and the clothes on her back and the look of a person who'd been told for years that she was worth nothing and had finally started to believe it. And that look was the thing he couldn't stop thinking about late at night in his own quiet house. And if you've ever watched someone you care about carry that kind of shame, you know it doesn't lift with a few kind words. because it isn't a mood, it's a weight they've learned to hold as part of themselves. What Daniel didn't know yet was the worst part, the part no one had told him, the part that would change how he saw every flinch and every silence she gave him. One night he was on the porch putting the last coat on the railing, and she came out in bare feet and stood at the top of the steps and told him, flat and low, that she didn't need a babysitter. He didn't argue with her or try to talk her out of it, because he'd learned a long time ago that you can't reason a person out of a wall they built to survive. He just said the railing was genuinely broken, and so was she, and both things could be true without him making a speech about it. And then he held out a glass of water he'd brought out for himself. She took it, and her fingers brushed his for half a second, and she pulled her hand back like the touch had cost her something, but she took the glass and she drank from it, and she stayed out there on the porch with him while the dark came down. It was a small thing, a glass of water passing from one hand to another on a dark porch, but in the language of people who've been closed up tight, that was the first word of a sentence. No one had heard from her in a long time. The weeks moved the way weeks move in a house where someone is healing, slow and uneven, 2 steps forward and 1 step back into the couch, with the blanket pulled up. Healing isn't a straight line. Daniel kept finding quiet reasons to be at Joseph's place, fixing the screen door that stuck, tuning the old truck that hadn't run right in a year, mending the back fence where the posts had rotted through. He never once asked Olivia how she was feeling, because he understood that a question like that, asked too soon, just makes a wounded person perform a version of being fine. He worked, and she started sitting on the porch while he worked, first at the far end and then a chair closer, and the distance between them shortened by inches, the way a tide comes in. He didn't remark on it, and she didn't either, and that was the agreement they made without speaking, that the getting closer would just happen, and neither of them would name it until it was already true. The first moment he saw her differently came on an ordinary afternoon when her father said something dumb and obvious, and she laughed. It wasn't a big laugh, just a small, surprised sound that escaped before she could catch it, and Daniel looked up from the screen door and felt the ground shift a little under him. She wasn't the kid with the skinned knees anymore, and he'd known that. But knowing it and feeling it were two different things, and what he felt in that half second was a jolt that had no place in him. He looked away fast, almost guilty, and he went home early that day with his tools still half in the truck, and he sat in his own quiet kitchen and tried to tell himself he was just tired or just caught off guard. He knew what it was. He wasn't tired, and he hadn't been caught off guard, and he knew it. But a man will reach for any excuse when the real reason is one he doesn't want to hold in his hands. Olivia began to test him, the way wounded people test the people who get close, because she needed to know where the edges were before she could let herself feel safe there. One afternoon she turned sharp on him and told him he didn't have to keep pretending he cared about a broken-down porch, that he could stop coming around and no one would blame him, and her voice had the same flat edge her voice had carried the first night on the porch. He didn't get defensive or promise her anything, because promises were the currency of the man who'd broken her, and she'd heard enough of those to last a few lifetimes. He just said the porch was genuinely broken, and so was she, and he wasn't the kind of man who walked away from a thing just because it was hard, and then he went back to the screen door without making anything more of it. Something in her face shifted then, a softening so small he almost missed it, and she didn't say anything else, but she didn't go inside either, and she stayed out there with him until the light went and the crickets started up. A few days later, she mentioned, almost to the air rather than to him, that she used to paint before, back when she had the studio and the kids and a life that felt like hers. She said it the way people say the names of the dead, with a flatness that's really a kind of grief, and Daniel didn't push her on it or ask her what she missed most. He just listened, and a few days after that, he left a cheap set of watercolors and a pad of paper on the porch table without a word attached, the way you leave food for a stray you don't want to spook. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect her to, because gratitude wasn't the point, and he hadn't done it to be thanked. The next morning, though, there was a small painting of the oak tree in the yard propped against the door where he'd find it. The first thing she'd made in years, and she'd made it for him. And that painting said more than any words could have, because it meant her hands had remembered how to make something again. The slow burn deepened across a stretch of weeks that folded into each other the way summer days do, hot and long and full of small things that only matter when you look back at them. Small things matter most. Daniel taught her to patch the drywall in the hallway, where a leak had left a brown stain, and his hands were near hers as she learned to spread the mud even. And neither of them moved away, and neither of them moved closer. She started bringing him coffee in the mornings without being asked, just setting it on the porch rail where he'd see it, a cup of black for him and a cup with too much sugar for her. And that small ritual became the shape of their days. He noticed that she slept better on the nights he came by, and she noticed that he stayed longer when she was quiet rather than sharp. And they were learning each other the way you learn a house you've decided to live in, one room at a time, one creaky floorboard at a time. There was the afternoon she helped him carry the old lumber out to the barn, and her shoulder bumped his in the doorway, and she didn't flinch for the first time, and he filed that away like a man filing away something precious he wasn't sure he was allowed to keep. The thunderstorm is where it changed. The night the power went out and the whole town went dark, and the sky broke open over the roof like something had finally given way. Daniel had been on the porch when it hit, and he came inside to check the breakers and found her sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the wall, not crying and not shaking, just still and small in a way that told him everything about what her nights must have looked like before. He didn't touch her because touch was a complicated thing for a woman like her, and he knew it in his bones, and he didn't ask her what was wrong, because what was wrong was old and big and not a thing you fix with a question. He just sat down on the floor across from her, close enough that she could hear him breathe, and he stayed there in the dark and said nothing at all, and the silence between them filled up with something that wasn't empty. He stayed. The storm passed, and the power stayed out, and at some point her breathing slowed to match his, and she leaned her head back against the wall and let out a long breath like a person setting down a weight she'd been carrying for years. And that was the thing that started to undo her. Not a word or a gesture, but the plain fact of a man who stayed when staying cost him nothing and meant everything. And that's the thing about staying, is that it doesn't look like much while it's happening, just a person sitting still in a dark room, but to someone who's only ever been left, that's the loudest love a person can give. Daniel knew what he was feeling by then, and he wasn't the kind of man who lied to himself about such things. So he let himself know it in the quiet hours, and then he pushed it back down where it had to live. She was his best friend's daughter, and she was wounded in ways he could see, and probably in ways he couldn't, and anything he did could look like the same kind of man who'd taken advantage of her before. The thought made him sick in a way he couldn't ignore. The idea that his patience could look like a predator's patience, that his kindness could be read as a trap set slowly over months, and that fear kept him up more nights than the feeling itself did. So he started pulling back just slightly, not cold and never cold, but careful, A half step of distance he put between them, like a hand held up to say, "Not yet, maybe not ever." He still came by, and he still fixed things, and he still drank the coffee she left him, but he watched where he put his eyes, and he kept the conversations about the work and the weather and the small, safe things that didn't cost anyone anything. Olivia noticed because she was good at reading distance. She'd spent years learning how, and a woman who's learned to read the weather of a man's mood can feel a cold front before it arrives. One morning, she asked him, quiet and direct, whether she'd done something wrong, and the question landed in him like a stone in still water because the truth was the opposite of what she feared. She'd done everything right, and that was the whole problem, and he couldn't tell her that without telling her everything, and he wasn't ready to tell her everything because he wasn't sure he had the right. He deflected the way good men deflect when they're trying to protect someone from themselves, and he told her she hadn't done anything, and his voice was too steady and too careful, and she heard the care in it and the wall behind it both at once. They both felt the distance go back up a little, and this time it was his wall, not hers, and she knew the difference, even if he didn't. And that difference was about to cost them both more than either of them could see. She pulled away hard after that, harder and faster than she'd opened up, because the one thing she couldn't survive again was the slow retreat of a person she let herself trust. Trust, once pulled back, broke worse than it had before. To her, distance always meant the same thing, that she was too much, that she was broken past fixing, that she wasn't worth staying for, and the man who just pulled back was the first person in years who'd made her feel safe. She stopped sitting on the porch, and she stopped leaving the coffee out, and she stopped painting, and the small painting of the oak tree got turned face down on the table like she couldn't bear to look at what she'd been building toward. The house went quiet in that heavy way. It had been quiet when she first arrived, and Joseph felt it like a change in pressure, the air thick and wrong, and no one saying why. She told her father, one evening, over a plate she barely touched, that she was thinking about leaving again, going somewhere no one knew her name, starting over in a place where she didn't carry the weight of who she'd been. Joseph called Daniel that night with fear in his voice, the same thin, scared tone from the first call, and he asked Daniel what had happened, because something had, and he didn't understand it, and his daughter was talking about leaving like a person talks about disappearing. Daniel stood in his own kitchen holding the phone and listening to his best friend sound afraid, and he knew, with a certainty that sat heavy in his chest, that he'd caused this. He'd done the careful thing, the right thing, the thing a good man is supposed to do, and it had hurt her worse than if he'd just been honest with her from the start. He told Joseph he'd come by, and he hung up, and he stood there for a long minute in the dark before he drove over, because he knew that whatever he said tonight was going to change the shape of everything, and there was no version of it that didn't cost him something. She was on the porch when he got there, a bag half packed beside her on the swing, and she wouldn't look at him, her eyes on the dark yard and her jaw set. In that way he'd learned meant she'd already made her decision. He stood at the bottom of the steps, and he didn't come up, because coming up uninvited was a thing he would never do. And he said the truest and simplest thing he had, which was that he'd pulled back because he was afraid of what he felt, not because of anything she'd done. He told her he hadn't wanted to be another man who took something from her while she was still healing, that he'd rather hurt her with distance than hurt her the way the other one had. His voice cracked on the last few words. The first time she'd ever heard anything in him give way. He said he'd been trying to do the right thing and he'd done it badly, and he was sorry, and the word sorry came out plain and heavy, like a man setting down a load he'd carried too long. She stared at him, then really looked at him for the first time in weeks, and her face did something it hadn't done since she came home. She cried, and the tears came because someone had just told her the truth instead of leaving, something no one had done for her in a very long time, and these tears were cleaner than any he'd seen from her, less tangled up with shame. She didn't pack the bag that night, and it sat on the porch swing through the dark hours like a question that had finally been answered. Daniel stayed in his truck in the driveway until the porch light went off, and only then did he drive home with his chest full of something that felt like fear and relief and hope all pressed together into one feeling he couldn't name. Joseph found out, the way fathers find out, not from a confession, but from the small telltale shifts that a man who's known you 40 years can read like weather. A father knows. He saw the way Daniel couldn't quite look at him the same anymore, the way his eyes slid sideways when the conversation got anywhere near Olivia, and the way Olivia's whole face changed when Daniel walked through the door, lit up from somewhere deep, the way a house lights up when someone comes home to it. A father knows the difference between gratitude and something more, and Joseph knew because he'd watched her light up for the wrong man once, and he'd sworn he'd pay closer attention the next time. He carried it in silence for a few days, watching the two of them circle each other in his own house, the coffee on the rail, the glances held a beat too long, the way Daniel had started leaving later and coming earlier, and finding reasons to be near her that weren't about the repairs anymore. He wasn't angry at first, just watchful, the way a man is watchful when he senses something moving in his own house that he didn't invite in. One evening after Olivia had gone to bed, he sat with Daniel on the porch and he asked, straight and quiet, whether Daniel had feelings for his daughter. The question sat between them like a stone dropped on a table, and Daniel didn't dodge it or dress it up, because lying to Joseph would have cost him more than he could live with. He told the truth in the plain words he had, that he hadn't planned it, that he'd fought it for weeks, that he would never have let it happen if she weren't already the person he'd choose in any version of his life. He told Joseph he'd walk away if that was what Joseph asked, because the friendship came first, because it had to, because a man who'd given his word for 40 years doesn't break it over a feeling, even a feeling this big and this frightening. He said it looking his friend in the eye, and his voice was steady, the way it was steady, about everything, and Joseph could hear that he meant it down to the ground and that the meaning was costing him something he couldn't hide. This wasn't a man choosing between desire and duty in some selfish way, and Joseph could see that, which is what made the whole thing harder rather than easier. Daniel was offering to lose the thing he wanted most because the man who trusted him with his daughter had asked him to watch over her and not love her, and he was willing to do it, and that willingness was the very thing that proved he was nothing like the man who'd broken her. The other one had taken and never once offered to give anything up, and here was Daniel offering to give up the only thing that had made his quiet life feel less quiet in years. Joseph's reaction wasn't the clean anger you'd expect, and that surprised Daniel, who'd braced for shouting and gotten something harder instead. Joseph was scared, not for himself, but for his daughter, because she'd been broken once and he couldn't sit through watching it happen again, and his fear came out quiet and careful and a lot more painful than rage would have been. But he'd also been watching her come back to life over these weeks, painting again and laughing at the table and sleeping through the night for the first time in months. And he knew Daniel, knew his hands were steady and his word was good. He told Daniel he needed to think, and the word think hung in the air, a door left ajar, neither open nor closed, and Daniel nodded because he understood that a man needed time with a thing this size. Then Joseph went inside and left Daniel standing in the driveway, sick with the waiting and the not knowing. And Daniel drove home and sat on his own porch in the dark and thought about the girl with the skin knees and the woman she'd become and the friend he might lose either way. And if Joseph said yes, he'd owe him something he could never. Olivia found out the way these things come out, not from a confession, but from a half sentence she overheard, and the look on Daniel's face when she asked him about it. Honesty was the one thing she'd asked for. She learned that he'd told her father how he felt before he'd told her, and the hurt that rose in her wasn't about the feeling itself. It was about the one thing she'd asked of the world after the ex. She'd asked for honesty, plain and simple, because dishonesty was the air she'd breathed for years, and the man she trusted had kept the biggest thing quiet, even if his reasons were the kind of reasons a good man has. She came out to the porch where everything between them had happened, and she didn't yell because she was past yelling, and she asked him, quiet and low, why he couldn't have said it to her first. The question was simple, and it was the whole thing in one breath, and Daniel heard in it the weight of every lie the other man had ever told her dressed up as protection. Daniel's answer was the climax of the whole story, the thing everything before it had been building toward without knowing it. He told her he'd been afraid that saying it out loud would make him just another man who wanted something from her when she was still putting herself back together. And that fear had kept his mouth shut even when his heart was wide open. He told her he'd wanted her to heal first, to be whole on her own, so that if she ever chose him, it would be from strength and not from need, because he'd watched what happened when a woman chose a man because she couldn't survive without him. He said he'd rather have lost her than have her for the wrong reason, and it came out low and rough, his hands steady, the way they were always steady, and she could see it was costing him everything to say it out loud after weeks of holding it back. That answer broke her open in a different way than the tears on the porch had, because it was the first time anyone had treated her healing as more important than having her, and she saw, finally, what real love looked like, and it was nothing like what she'd survived. She told him she wasn't whole yet, and she might never be, but she was strong enough to choose him, and she was choosing him now, not because she needed him to survive, but because she wanted him to live. She said the word choose like it was the most important word she'd ever said, and it was, because for years she'd had no choices at all, and now she was making one with her eyes open and her feet planted. Daniel reached for her hand the way he'd wanted to for weeks, slowly enough that she could pull away if she needed to, and she didn't pull away, and her fingers closed around his and held on like they'd been waiting to do it for a long time. They stayed like that on the porch while the dark came down, two people who'd been broken in different ways sitting together in the quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the silence between them didn't hold any fear in it at all. The 2 days of waiting were the longest Daniel could remember, longer than the year of the divorce, longer than the nights after his parents passed, because this time the thing he was waiting to lose was a thing he'd only just found. He didn't go to Joseph's house because the man had asked for time, and Daniel would give him every hour of it, even if the giving felt like slow bleeding. He worked in his shop, and he fixed a gate for a neighbor, and he tried to keep his hands busy, because busy hands were the only thing that kept his mind from running the same loop over and over. The loop where Joseph said no, and Daniel did the right thing, and Olivia healed without him, and the porch went back to holding one. Olivia texted him once, just a single line asking if he was okay, and he wrote back that he was fine and he hated himself a little for the lie, but the truth was too big for a phone screen and too shaky for him to hold out loud just yet. Joseph came back on the third evening, and he sat with Daniel on the same porch where everything between all of them had happened, and he told him he'd watched his daughter laugh again for the first time in a year. He said he'd be a fool to stand between that and his pride, because pride was a cheap thing next to a daughter coming back to life, and he'd carried enough cheap things in his time to know the difference. He'd spent 2 days turning it over, the fear and the gratitude all tangled up together, and what he'd come to was simpler than he expected, which was that Daniel was the first man in years who'd made his daughter safer rather than smaller. He told Daniel to be careful with her, and Daniel said he would, and he meant it the way he meant everything with his whole life, and not just his mouth. Then Joseph stood up and clapped him on the shoulder the way he'd clapped him 1,000 times over, 40 years, and he went inside, and that was the blessing, plain as bread, and a good deal harder to come by. Daniel could finally breathe. The ending wasn't a wedding or a grand gesture, because grand gestures were the language of the man who'd broken her, and neither of them had any use for that language anymore. It was just Daniel and Olivia on the porch one evening in the long blue light, her feet in his lap, and a half-finished painting drying on the table beside them. The oak tree from her first painting was there, and now it was joined by a second one with two small figures sitting under it, close enough that you could tell they belonged to each other. She was still healing, and he was still steady, and the love between them wasn't a rescue, but a porch light left on the kind that says you can come home whenever you're ready, and the door will be open. Her hand found his in the dark, and he closed his fingers around it, and neither of them said a word, because the best stories on a quiet porch are the ones that don't need any. If this one stayed with you, settle in and subscribe, because there's always another porch, another slow burn, another love that builds one small kindness at a time, and you're always welcome here.